I didn't grow up in America, but I subscribed to the American dream and I went over there to be a writer. I watched Sex in the City and I thought, oh, New York is a place to be, blah, blah, blah. So I go to New York and I spent 8 years there. And I'll just start with a story. I got punched in the face on the subway one time in 2020. So when the Stop Asian Hate movement was like well and truly alive, because there was so much xenophobia BS about the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus. And honestly, I think in America, because, the education is quite lacking, especially in regards to properly identifying many things in history. They don't even really know what a Chinese person looks like, let alone what the Chinese map looks like. And so anyone who just looks remotely Asian, they targeted, And when I say they, I just mean like, I don't know, people who were being indoctrinated to believe that China is the root of all problems and China is a reason that the virus happened and China is a reason that their relatives might have gotten sick or passed away. It was like some really dark conditioning that was going on, paired with the fear and the stress and the threat of this pandemic, lack of healthcare. You had to pay $150 for a simple COVID test. There was no precautions involved. Lockdown was very loose or, either very loose or very intense. It was just, there was no organized, it was just like a swinging, unpredictable all the time. So that was New York. But during 2020, I remember I was on the subway, things were open again, and I was on the subway. And this woman, she was houseless and she was walking through the subway asking for money. And at the same time, this Italian man came up to me and asked me directions to Chinatown, which, is a problem, is its own. So he was talking to me, he was speaking to me, but she looks directly at me and she goes, "Why are you talking while I'm talking?" And she swings and gets me right in the face. And I don't know if it was motivated by xenophobia, but, the Italian man was left unscathed and I was targeted for absolutely no reason, So that was my experience in New York, all that to say. And that in many ways was a huge awakening because up until that point, I think I had normalized being fearful of my life. Right? My nervous system was always like up here. I was just always super anxious, always, clutching my bag and, looking behind me. But that was almost a very normalized way of being after being there for so long. And that wake up call was me being like, wait, this is actually not okay. And it forced me to challenge. I mean, I had already not been a fan of America for a while, obviously, but I think that, these personal experience just further proved how America as a society functions and how you're left to your own, you have to help yourself. It's such an individualistic society. And so that was one of my horrific experiences in America. And like you said, I would travel to Manhattan a lot to do organizing work, and on the way there, the amount of poverty that you would see, the amount of people having mental breakdowns on the street or using drugs, and also, like you said, disproportionately, it affects African American and Indigenous people because it is purposefully racially segregated as well. Class plays a huge part in this. Like, class analysis is extremely necessary when we talk about America. So yeah, that was my experience there. And then similarly, coming to Shanghai, which is where my father is from, I was like, wait, I don't have to look behind my shoulder all the time.
It's possible.
Yeah, I'm like, wait, I'm biking everywhere and, I can leave my phone somewhere and no one will blink twice. And that almost for me, sometimes I'm like, I don't deserve this. There's this internal almost also guilt of being like, how can this be possible? Is this real? Is this a dream? So I'm also experiencing that shock, and I also experienced the shock of going to America. So I agree with you both. Yeah.
Well, did you fight back?
That's when.
I actually did not. No, I was so shocked. I was like literally like
So you just stood there.
I was sat down. I had just like been punched in the face, and actually this like tall white man, which I hate that this is how it happened, but a tall white man actually stood up in between us, and he was like, "Stop hitting her." Um, and then he offered to call the police, but then I knew that the police wouldn't be able to do anything. Also, I need to add that this woman was a white pregnant woman as well. So she was
Okay.
clearly very distressed. She was, as a pregnant woman, you shouldn't have to beg for money on the street. She was clearly going through something. And I was her target of the day.
That's intense.
It was intense. Yeah.
I mean, the only time I've actually been mugged was because I have family in Sweden, was at the Stockholm, the capital city, the Stockholm train station, where I happened to, my friend and I were traveling. I asked her, okay, look at the bags, I'm going to buy us the next tickets. And she fell asleep for like a second, and my whole, 35-liter bag was taken. But that also, I think, has to do with the fact that, like, this was around 2018, and this was a period of where we had the most immigrants coming from the Middle East, and Swedish society doesn't know how to integrate people and doesn't take their qualifications seriously, constantly puts them on the periphery. Even when I was there during the COVID pandemic, it was disproportionately migrant communities who are getting higher infection rates because they live in more densely populated spaces. A lot of public information wasn't very good. Sweden also did not. They were doing this whole line of, we can't inflict on people's individual rights, so we can't force people to wear masks or restrict movement, etc. Which in a society where I think it's 11 to 14 million people in the whole of Sweden, that's like half of Shanghai, basically. In a country that isn't very densely populated, they could have used the state, apparatus to swiftly isolate the kind of, what do you call it, the spreading zone.
Yeah.
Because they knew the people who were the spreaders,
right,
and they could have targeted them,
right,
stopped them, use the resources they actually have in these so-called social democracies that's supposed to care about the people. So it also was quite something to go from there, and then I came to China, also having been in South Africa for the last 12 years, and just seeing the fact that even in the most well-resourced places, if you don't have a government and a state who actually cares about the people and is willing to use all possible means to stop the spread of the virus or to deal with healthcare issues, then what's the point? Like,